Hello again, you guys. This is Miss Polson. This is Unit 1, Segment 2, Video Notes. Please remember the Cornell method of writing out your notes using the main part of your paper to write down the content, using the left edge to make any diagrams or ask any questions, and then the very, very bottom of your page you're going to use to summarize what's on that page. You'll appreciate it later. So Unit 1, Segment 2, we're covering the scientific method. The scientific method begins with observation, and from the observation you're going to be making a hypothesis. So a hypothesis, I know you've heard that word before, is an answer to a scientific question. It's a possible answer. It's stated firmly, however. It's never asked in question format. It's always written as a firm statement. It is an educated guess, but it's more than an educated guess, so please write in that it's an educated guess based on prior knowledge and is testable. So please make sure you put in educated guess based on prior knowledge and is testable, meaning you can actually run a test to test it. In class, we're going to use the if, then, because method of writing hypothesis simply because it's easier. It allows you to identify variables very easy and already has you looking at evidence because of the because part of it. So, you make observations, you have prior knowledge. You form a hypothesis. It's a firm statement. It's never I think, and it's never written in a question. Those are huge no-nos. You test the hypothesis. So here's just a few words that are really more about how science works rather than the actual method of a controlled experiment or something like that. So you have observations. Scientists are going to observe as much as they possibly can using all 5 senses. Okay? What can they hear? What can they see? What can they touch? What can they smell? All of those senses, and they'll write down as much as they possibly can. It's gathering up information, learning more about the natural environment so that you can then go and start to begin to ask questions and form hypotheses. So I see a frog. The frog is green. The frog is living in a pond. The frog is eating a fly. You know, these are all observations. Data. Scientists will always collect as much data as possible. Some of the data is going to come in the form of numbers, the dudes, and some of it will come in the form of observations, as far as like colors and things like that. Measurable. So example, time, you can measure in seconds. Mass in grams. You know, you can look at color change if we look at indicators. We can measure the volume. And what does it taste like? You know, how does it feel? This is all considered data. It doesn't always have to be numbers, but when it is numbers, it's called quantitative data. Quantities. You're looking at numbers, how much. So it's in some form of quantity. So mass, it was 10 grams. You know, volume, it was 10 ounces. And so on. Qualitative data. Qualitative is looking at the quality or descriptive element about what you're seeing. So it's not going to be in the form of numbers. It's going to be really in the form of words or adjectives. This is taken in as part of the data. I taught my IB kids when they ran an experiment to write down as much qualitative about it as they could. So when we tested plants, if the plant was wilted, that's something that is not necessarily measurable with an instrument, but it's definitely observed. And so I would have them make notes of that because you never know when that is going to come into play as far as supportive evidence of something happening. Inferences, I don't know if you've heard this word before, but an inference is a conclusion based on evidence and reasoning. And you are going to make many inferences in your life and in class. So when you see something happen and it's constantly followed by something else, for example, when you see the sky is gray, and then it's followed by rain, and every time you see that the sky is gray and it is followed by rain, you're making an observation, and consistently it's followed by rain, so that's an inference. It's going to rain. When I see that it's gray, it's going to rain. I don't get much sleep at night, right? You don't get much sleep, so you're not going to be functioning as well, and you may not get as good of grades as you would normally with great sleep. So if you don't get much sleep, I'm not going to do very well in my grades. That's an inference. Now the scientific method is, there are steps, and they're usually in a given order, and they usually start with a question, okay, that you make observations about. Do a little research. What is it supposed to be? What are the conditions during the time? And then you make a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that if then because statement, and you run an experiment. Test it. See if the hypothesis is supported or not. Collect the data, analyze it, make conclusions, and then scientists will publish their work. The purpose for publishing is so that other scientists can see what they've done. So similar scientists studying something similar can see their findings and maybe repeat their study. And the more repeats there are with consistent conclusions, the higher probability that it's going to become a theory. A controlled experiment, you're going to be setting one up. Controlled, part of that phrase, it means that you're going to control as much variables as you possibly can. You're only going to change one thing. When Reddy did his experiment with the meat, he controlled whether the jar was capped or whether it was not. So that was considered a controlled experiment because he controlled how big the jar was, what the temperature of the room was, how big the meat was, what the moisture level was. I mean, all those things he had to control, because if he didn't, it would not be a controlled experiment, and we wouldn't know what was making the end result, which variable. I think you guys did a friction lab in physics. You can think about that. What did you control when you tested that? We'll be talking about many more controlled experiments in class as well, and you will be looking at several examples in your work too. But with any kind of experiment, you're going to have variables. Those are going to be some kind of factor that will, in an experiment, that can actually change. Some variables you're going to want to control, manipulate. And some variables are just out there, and sometimes they're sneaky, and they sneak in and you forget to control them because they're sneaky. So time is a variable. Growth of plants is a variable. How much light is available is a variable. How much water is given is a variable. How much nutrients there are. I mean, anything that you're going to be testing, you're going to have to look deep. You have to think out of the side of the box. You have to get creative, and you have to really be deep thinkers as far as what kind of sneaky little variables are going to come in here. Two main types of variables. We're going to work with these in class. There is an independent variable. That's the one that you are manipulating. And then there's the dependent variable. That's going to depend on the independent variable. So that's the first variable that you are actually, independent is the first variable that you're actually controlling. It's the one that you're actually testing to see if it makes any difference. So when in the friction lab, if you change the surfaces, so for example, if there was carpet versus something of smooth surface, that is something that you're going to control. You're going to see, does the carpet or the smooth surface have a difference in friction? The dependent variable in any given controlled experiment is going to be one that is actually dependent upon the independent. So if you're changing the surface for the friction lab, friction itself is going to be your dependent variable. It's something that you're going to measure. The variable that changes as a result of the IV stands for independent variable. So if you're manipulating a plant, let's say you're watering it differently, you want to see if the amount of water has an impact, you're going to control the water, you're going to manipulate the water, so that's your independent variable. And the height that the plant grew is also being measured, and that is going to depend on the amount of water, so therefore it is the dependent variable. It's not one that you are directly manipulating. It may or may not change as a result of the independent variable. These can get a little tricky, you guys, so we will definitely be working with this more, and hopefully you'll feel a better confidence about it. Control variable, these are variables that you have to control. I mean, they're not ones that you're manipulating, they're not necessarily ones that you are measuring to determine your hypothesis, but they're things that you need to keep controlled. You have to keep everything the same except for the one independent variable that you are changing. So, with your friction lab, you have your mass, the force, the sled. Those are all the same for every single test. If you're testing plants, you better make sure that it's the same kind of plant, that it's the same size to start out with. You know, if one has a flower and the other one doesn't, that is a difference, and you got to control that. You can't have one plant outside and one plant inside if what you're measuring is water. That's two different conditions. You didn't control all of the variables. They have to be, everything has to be identical, and that's the hardest part. Every single aspect of the experiment has to be identical to each other in order for us to determine whether or not, for example, water impacts plant growth. You know, everything has to be the same. If I'm giving Miracle-Gro to the plants just to keep them sustained, then I better make sure that I give the same amount of Miracle-Gro. Because if I give more Miracle-Gro to the one I'm giving more water to, that could skew my results, and I don't know if it's the water that did it or if it was the Miracle-Gro that did it. So you have to control everything. The only difference is your independent variable. So in a perfectly controlled experiment, you guys, every single part of the experiment would be controlled with the exact same, except for that one independent variable that you are manipulating. You're trying to see if it has an impact. Theory is a term that you must know, you guys. You have hypothesis and you have theory, and we've talked about this in class, which has more weight. Hypothesis is your starter. It's like you've made observations, you have prior knowledge, you're going to go ahead and explain something, some kind of explanation, but it's going to be, which is then going to be tested. But it's at its kind of beginning stage. Well, what happens if hundreds, if yet thousands of scientists test the hypothesis and they all get the same conclusion? That's pretty heavy. That's a lot of weight. I mean, that's heavy. That's huge. That means that we can now look at that hypothesis as what we call a theory. So oftentimes, obviously our theories are an explanation, but they are backed with massive amounts of evidence. The law of gravity. I mean, oh my gosh, there's so much evidence to support that. The cell theory, that every living thing is composed of cells. Nobody argues that anymore because there's so much evidence to support that, right? Theory of evolution. You know, there's so many theories out there. The Big Bang theory of how our universe began. There's so much evidence to support that it's no longer a hypothesis, it's now a theory. So theories are big, and it's a huge misused word in society, right? You're with your friends. My theory is that he doesn't like her because, you know, he doesn't call her or whatever. I mean, when people throw that out like it's my theory, it's really very misused because in science it's heavy. It is a big, big word that holds a lot of weight. We hold it very, very high in science. So scientific theory is different than your friend's theory. And that is where we stop, friends. That's segment 2. You guys are going to be performing a controlled experiment after this. And then we have 1/3 segment that will finish out this unit, you guys. So unit 1 will be done, and then the books. All right. Enjoy.